All right, everyone. Today we're going to do a really quick exercise. We're going to basically try to Photoshop grass into the lawn of this rendering of this building, right? So this is a basic stark, white clay render that you got this is from Maxwell, which is the render we're going to learn later on in the semester, and with no textures really applied. And let's just say you kind of want to spice up the lawn, right, by adding some grass, right? Now these images will be supplied to you in the zip file that comes with this week. So I think it's called Photoshop water_grass, and this is the grass texture that we'll be working with. Now you'll notice that this grass texture is a perspective shot. Right, so the grass in the foreground is larger, the grass in the background is further away, right? And that's important because you basically will want to try to match the scale of this. Now, there will be parts of this video where it's sort of more monotonous, repetitive stuff, so I'll be speeding up the clips at certain points. So, you'll notice that, the audio might just go crazy or something, but, I'll just sort of speed it up in order to save time. So I guess the first thing you want to do probably is just to go to the grass layer here, or the grass image, Control A to select everything, V to make sure you're using the move tool, and just drag and drop it into the image here. Now this is a pretty big grass image, and if you type Control T to get the transform, hold down Shift so it scales correctly, but I just kind of use the Control T to get it roughly into shape. Now, what you probably want is this part to be slightly above the horizon line, basically, right? And you want to look at the foreground grass, and you want to roughly get the scale. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But kind of get the scale to something that seems reasonable. And don't worry about we can sort of duplicate this many times and blend it in, right? So you will want to kind of position it so it's roughly above the horizon line, since it's all the way over there. And what I do is I right click on the grass layer, duplicate it, say okay, and just sort of move it to the side like that. Duplicate again, move it to the side. So basically you're doing this 3 times, and sometimes you just don't want the same patterns to happen again and again, so you could try to invert it, whatever. Edit, transform, flip horizontal, for example. So I flip that one horizontally. You can rearrange if you don't like, the way that was working. So you don't get so many problems with basically the same texture overlapping, that sort of thing. It looks a little bit more seamless, maybe, right? That's all right. We'll do other stuff to kind of solve that. Now what I would do at this point is take all these 3 layers. So click on the first one, hold down Shift, and click on the third one to select them all 3 together, and merge layers, right? You can double click it and give it, let's say a grass, the layer name grass. All right, so you should have the sort of seamless expanse of grass at this point, overlaid right above the horizon there. All right. Now, if I'm looking at this, the grass in the foreground is still going to look a little bit too big, out of scale. So what we're going to do is actually, one of my favorite tools in Photoshop is this guy here, the clone stamp tool. The shortcut key for it is the S. So with the clone stamp tool chosen, and the grass layer active like that, basically, if you go to your swatches or your brushes, and I actually don't know if this will show up, but look for the one that looks like a bunch of grass. I think, it's Steve. There are 2 brushes here. one that's a blade that goes in one direction, and one's it's like basically 3 blades of grass. And you can scale it a little bit larger or smaller, right? So this is the grass brush, if you will. Now with the grass brush, what you do is you hold down the Alt key. When you hold down the Alt key, it will give you a target or a source position. And you could click there, and then you can click on the using the brush and paint elsewhere. And what that'll do is it basically will sample whatever you were clicking on, wherever you were clicking on, using that as a source to paint over. So in this case, I'm going to take basically some of the glass that's further in the background and sort of paint it over the stuff in the foreground. So you can, and perhaps you'll, and I'll kind of do this process several times, you know, progressively moving down a little bit, and you can sort of wiggle, you know, the mouse back and forth, right? To basically slowly and gradually bring down the scale of the grass. And take out some of the sort of bigger blades in the foreground. Now don't kind of make it too over the top, like the really tiny blades up front, but you kind of want it to give it a bit more evenly distributed look. All right, don't worry about it too much. Just sort of give it a once over. We'll sort of fine tune things a little bit later. Okay, now the next step, you can do this any manner of ways, but basically what we're trying to do, or what we will be trying to do, is to kind of select the gray ground, excluding the parts that are the walls, right? Maybe the sort of bottom portion, not the driveway. So we'll be trying to select that and everything that's sort of below the trees here. So the part of the ground that we want to be grass, basically. Okay. Now you can do this as a mask. You can do this, you know, to kind of select things, whatever. It really doesn't matter. You can erase it. But I'm going to be using, in my case, I'm going to be using the quick selection tool. Simply because I like the sort of ability to add and subtract from a selection. Now I'm going to pick that sort of first icon here. This is the plus minus, add or subtract, which, you know, as always with all the Photoshop selection tools, Control and Alt will control will add or subtract from it, and pick a slightly bigger brush size, and so try to basically kind of go through the sort of bottom part of the ground. And you know, if it doesn't select something you want correctly, you can always subtract from it, or try to subtract from it. Whether or not it does it accurately, you can always sort of go back and take it out another way. But I'm just gonna go through here, and okay, that selected a lot. So I'm gonna start subtracting again. All right, so I'm not going to worry about it if the selection is not too perfect. You probably just want to combine and use the lasso tool to take out some that are obvious, like the wall where it is selecting it. Use the polygonal lasso tool. Hold down the Alt T to get the minus, and lasso out the parts that you don't want your selection to select. Right there, this part of the wall. That doesn't have to be too precise. You'll probably want to add this person back in. We can take care of the legs later. And maybe just clean this corner back out. All right, so now let's look at this corner and subtract out this part of the wall that's sort of towards the back. That makes sense there. And then now let's worry about this stuff. Now this stuff, as you can see, is a lot harder to select, right? So we go back to our Refine Edge tool. I have this view on the overlay just to kind of see. And with the sort of adequately sized brush that you can sort of change here, basically what you want to do is kind of paint the boundaries that you want it to kind of look at again. So, you know, around where the leaves are, bounding, you know, parts that kind of might have some issues or some problems. Say okay, and make sure that you're outputting it to a selection, right? Say okay, and it should do a decent job. It should do a decent job, and you know, if not, you know, just sort of go in and edit it. But I'm not, you know, we don't have to obsess too much about this. Okay, so now we have a pretty decent selection, you know, of what we're trying to take out, or basically what we want to see come in as grass. What you want to do now is to save the selection, and you will get this dialog box, right, and give it a name, grass select. Okay. All right, now that will be in your channels, right? So you can always basically get this back at some point. We'll be using it. All right. Okay, that's most of the hard work done. So what we want to do is still have the selection active, right? Or if you accidentally lost the selection because you saved it, you can always go back to load selection and load your grass select, right? So you can load the selection back, okay? Now, what you want to do is with the grass layer active and showing, right? Now you want to invert the selection. So Control-Shift-I or select inverse, right? And just type delete, which will basically delete out the rest and not the grass. So you have something that basically fits pretty close now, all right? We'll still have to do a little bit of editing. And this is actually a good point to try to kind of match the tone a little bit. So go into your sort of adjustments, use saturation, maybe pull down the saturation of just a little bit, 20, 30, something like that. You can mess with the hue if you want. But we're actually going to play around with some other stuff a little bit later. So, there's no sort of big rush, but this is good to kind of get a sense of what things will look like. Now, going back to the clone stamp tool, we're still using the sort of grass brush, right? And with a sort of relatively normal sized brush, And basically you want it to be smaller the further away you are in the horizon. You want it to be bigger if you're closer, right? But you will kind of look at these edges and try to soften them by adding little grass bits to them, like that. All right, so there's no real, right or wrong here. You just, trying to kind of make it look, roughly as natural as possible. Make the size look roughly correct, and basically get the sort of edges a little bit uneven, right? So they're not so sharp as they're sort of cut out. And maybe a little bit of really small ones on the horizon, just to kind of make that sort of sharp line go away just a little bit. And if you make a mistake, you can always delete it back. And in some of these places, you can actually use the eraser and the eraser also has the grass brush as well. So with the eraser, you can actually use the grass brush to kind of take out parts as well. And so you're not just cloning stuff, but you can actually erase into stuff, erase into the grass as well. So that works. Make sure your opacity is 100 in this case, so you can sort of pick away at things if you've been a little bit overzealous. All right, so let's say you're satisfied with that. I probably could have paid a little bit more detail to some of the transitions and things like that, but I'm just sort of trying to get this through to show you the steps, right? Okay, so the next thing I do here often is actually take the layer channel or the sort of layer mixing sort of option, the blending modes here, and change it from normal. And you can try a couple of these, but overlay or hard light usually works pretty well. So overlay will make it look like this, which actually exposes the shadows that were originally underneath it, so you don't have to kind of really redo those. Hard light, I think, works pretty well as well. Okay. But what you want to do now, after you kind of apply this so you get a better sense of things, it'll mesh a little bit better because there's a little bit of transparency involved right at this point. So it'll fit a little better. Now, we're actually going to use the burn and dodge tool, which is here. The shortcut for this is O. So the burn and dodge tool are used to add shadow and highlights. So what you want to do with the burn tool, for example, here, and I'll basically set exposure up here to roughly around 50%. We'll do midtones for now. And what you want to do is to just basically, take a softer brush, maybe pretty big, and like this should be under the trees, right? So you can go through and the soft brush sort of darken parts of this where it kind of makes sense, right? So look at the overall composition. And grass, the sort of shadow in grass, as you kind of see, is always a little bit uneven, right? So you can just add a little bit of unevenness here and there make it look a little bit more natural, right? So it's not all this sort of bright stuff everywhere. And the trick is really, and you can sort of darken these parts where like, okay, there was originally more shadow, or maybe this part where it was sort of the ramp, so it kind of makes sense that the sort of color or the direction of the grass is slightly different. If you kind of hide that to get a sense of where things are, or you can bump down the transparency just a tad bit, right? And get a sense of where that was. So, you know, make that patch a little darker because it's sort of facing away from you. Okay. And so there's a little bit more sort of, you know, natural sense to the grass. Manipulate the shadows a little bit. That's the dot burn tool. Now with the dodge tool, what the dodge tool does, it basically will brighten parts back up. So you can, oops, I probably overdid that. So, you know, some of this sort of further away stuff, depending, you know, if it's sort of under the trees, then I would probably use the burn tool, darken it a little bit, layer it a little bit so, you know, it looks a bit natural, right? But then over there it's brighter, you know, so you use the dodge tool to lighten some of that up. Just introduce a little bit of sort of irregularity into the overall sort of grass texture. And like I said, there's no real sort of right way to do this. You just, you know, have to kind of wing it and just see what you feel. All right. So, you know, that's one way of doing things. And you can always sort of smooth things out if you kind of overdid it somewhere. Just reverse it. All right, and so now the last step, I'm actually just going to use the blur tool here, the blur tool that's right above the burn and dodge tool, with strength of 100 and a pretty big normal brush. And I'm just going to kind of blur out the horizon here a little bit. So just click and sort of drag it across the further parts, just so it's not so sharp, right, in focus. And just drag it a couple times. And you'll have to kind of use your judgment on that. It's a little bit subtle, but you know, when you zoom in, you'll see that, you know, the sort of further bits get blurred out a little bit. Maybe not 100%. Should probably start with something a little less strong. Let's try 65. And it's a little bit smaller. And you can sort of zoom in a little bit so you can kind of see what you're doing. Yeah, something like that. Right. So that'll, and especially sort of down here in the shadows, you can do that a little bit. So you get that sort of deeper sense, right? And you know, the grass doesn't just like stick out like crazy. All right, and play with the opacity a little bit if it's getting a little bit too strong, or go back and, you know, play with your hue saturation or the brightness. Probably, you know, just in this case, because this is a sort of white clay rendering, you know, just desaturate it a little bit more. A little bit, and you know, if you want, you can bump up the contrast. Okay, and so you can see the shadows that were originally there. You can try to bring them back more if you wanted to, and just to sort of remember to get this sort of, use the eraser and, you know, cut this guy's legs out But if you're using the brush, sort of grass brush for the eraser, you can just basically do that. And have a little bit still, right? A little bit of grass covering his legs. All right, so that's sort of the idea. It's pretty simple. There's only one layer, and you've been sort of more working on that layer. But that's more or less it.